Californians have traditionally taken for granted a plentiful supply of water. Severe shortages, particularly in Northern California, have been so rare as to be beyond the memory of most consumers. Wasteful water usage throughout the state was a way of life with many people. The prevailing attitude was that there had always been, and probably always would be, a plentiful water supply. However, in the fall of 1975, an unusual phenomenon was taking shape. Over the Pacific Ocean, west of the California coast, an almost stationary high-pressure ridge was forming. This caused the storm systems that normally track over northern and central California to be diverted north over Canada and south over Mexico. There were brief periods when the ridge broke down, but it soon reformed and functioned as a barrier to incoming Pacific storms. This strong but invisible barrier, nearly 2,000 miles in length, created the proper meteorological conditions to cause one of California's most alarming periods.
California is essentially a semi-arid land with long, hot, dry summers. Normally, 70% of the annual rain or snowfall occurs between December and April. Much of this water is stored in reservoirs or accumulated in the mountain snowpack for use during the dry periods. However, December of 1975 came and left with generally sunny skies and very little precipitation. But as yet, no alarm bells were ringing. The capriciousness of California weather is such that a large part of a total year's rain and snow may fall in 3 or 4 weeks of January and February. But January of 1976 did not follow the pattern. This traditionally wet month furnished even less water than the preceding December's sparse contribution, about half, in fact. Although there was still little indication of the extent of the forthcoming drought, an economic impact was already beginning to be felt, particularly among cattlemen. Ranchers faced with a scant growth of rangeland grasses, coupled with fast-rising prices for other feed, began dumping their livestock on the market.
Would carry about 2,000 head of cattle through the peak period of the year. During the time that we went through the drought here, we were carrying 20 to 25% of our normal capacity, and there were periods during the summer months when there weren't any cattle on the ranch.
Farmers in the fruit and nut tree belt of the Sacramento Valley were beginning irrigation as early as February 1st to ensure blossoming in their orchards. Normally, irrigation here is not required until mid-April or May. February, March, and April of 1976 brought a little rainfall, but not nearly enough. Unexpectedly, much of the rain during this 3-month period fell in the usually arid areas from Bakersfield south to San Diego. Even prior to the drought, as part of a new emphasis on conservation, the California Department of Water Resources had already begun a vigorous Save Water campaign. Local water agencies also started encouraging customers to practice voluntary water conservation. At the end of the normal rainfall season, calculated as of May 1st, total precipitation statewide was only 65% of the norm. The state was beginning to hurt. Storage in the major reservoirs was low, with little relief in sight because of a nearly non-existent Sierra snowpack. Groundwater levels were being drawn down, and farmers started deepening and refitting old wells and drilling new ones.
When we realized, as time progressed, there was going to be a very limited supply of water available from our surface source, we all hurried into our pump companies and the local utility companies requesting pumps and electrical hookups, and found that everybody else in the valley had the same problem. Instead of taking 2 or 3 weeks to get a pump, this pump that I ordered took 4 months.
Among the hardest hit were dry farm grain growers with neither surface nor groundwater supplies available. Water supply problems were also becoming acute in small urban communities throughout Marin, Sonoma, and other coastal and foothill fringe counties. These areas are normally supplied by small surface reservoirs and low-yield wells, both at this point rapidly running dry. The long unused word rationing became a threat in many communities and reality in some others. Meantime, programs and suggestions for urban water savings were being put into effect statewide. Home conservation began to be practiced on a larger scale. Devices such as bottles or plastic dams were being placed in toilet tanks. And low-flow shower heads were getting a big play. Conservation, in fact, began to be so effective that local water agencies with billing directly related to meter readings were faced with a decrease in revenues. To offset the deficit, rates were raised, thus supplying less water for the same or even more money. This created a circumstance sometimes difficult to justify to the consumer.
Quantity discounts encourage you to buy more of something. For example, suppose you buy 1 apple for 15 cents. You would be getting a quantity discount if you could then buy 10 apples for only 10 cents apiece. And an even better buy if 100 apples cost only 5 cents each. It's a good way to sell a lot of apples, if you have them. In many cities, water is sold that way too. A basic rate is charged for minimum water use. As more water is consumed, the cost per gallon is less. The biggest water users generally pay the lowest rates. It's a good way to sell a lot of water, if you have it. But in California, water is a scarce commodity. There is not enough to waste. The California Department of Water Resources urges you to stretch our supply. Save water.
Another unhappy byproduct of the drought was low hydroelectric generation, an inevitable result of low reservoir levels. California's production of hydroelectric energy was down 50% in 1976. It is estimated that an extra 28 million barrels of oil was used by steam generating plants to offset the deficit. As 1976 wore on, there was the ugly specter of possibly another year of drought. State and federal water agencies started to plan for the worst, another dry year. On March 4th, 1977, Governor Brown, by executive order, established a drought emergency task force and named the commander of the California National Guard as its director. One of his first official duties was to chair the governor's drought conference in Los Angeles on March 7th. One of the important accomplishments of the task force was to open communication channels with all levels of government for the exchange of information concerning local drought problems. Then came the long, hot summer of 1977. There was little doubt by this time that California was in trouble, but the populace, as well as the many government bodies involved, rose to the occasion. Public response was both remarkable and commendable as citizens willingly participated in water conservation programs. Brown lawns were much in evidence around the state, and a dirty car became a status symbol. Gray water, such as that discharged from dishwashers or washing machines, was utilized for watering household plants and shrubs. Restaurants stopped serving water to customers, unless asked for. Some served food on paper plates with plastic utensils and asked customers to pretend they were on a picnic to avoid using water for dishwashing. The residents of Marin County and other water-short areas got into the swing by placing signs at appropriate locations instructing guests not to flush.
We also were issued plastic bottles by the Marin Municipal Water District, which we filled with rocks and put in our toilet tanks so that each flush would take less water.
One of the hardest things for us during the drought was teaching our kids to conserve water. Little things like brushing their teeth and washing their hands with the tap off were things that they had to learn. Also, in the shower, to lather with the water off.
After we'd had a bath, we saved the grey water, also to water the plants. I didn't use the dishwasher at all. I did them by hand. And when we had a party, friends even came over with their own water. And we put that in the drinks and flushed the toilets with it even.
The trip we made that summer back to Colorado was interesting because it blew our minds, all the water that Grandma wasted washing her vegetables. And she thought we had turned into animals because we no longer flushed the John.
By this time, most of the state's 58 counties had been designated as disaster areas and were eligible for both federal and state relief. California received some $250 million, a lot of money, but small change compared to the actual losses incurred statewide during the 2-year period. There can be little argument that agriculture and its dependent industries suffer in any drought. But during 1977, many people who took their living from irrigated soil were feeling the dual pinch of both water shortages and financial stress. By this time, the State Water Project had cut water entitlements to agriculture users by 60%. Central Valley Project water was cut even more dramatically, down 75% for San Joaquin Valley agriculture.
My family and I run about a 2,200-acre operation out of Fireball, California. And as a result of the drought in 1977 and our water allotment being reduced by 75%, we were only permitted to farm 816 acres of our normal crop acreage. Some of this ground had already been prepared and fertilized in excess of the 816 acres, which added to our loss.
We were able to maintain our quality fairly well, but in 1977, when we really had the big drought and had to depend solely on underground water, our quality of olives probably, we lost at least $50 a ton on that, and that was, when you figure it over about 900 tons, you're talking about a lot of money. So,
besides the losses suffered by those dependent on agriculture, there were serious detrimental effects in other areas. Examples were snow sport and reservoir marine operators.
Now that was some way to turn around and salvage what little business we had, because as soon as the adverse publicity of the drought hit the people in the southern part of the state where most of our business is from, why then that ended it right there. They believed that we were actually dry, which at that time we still had 2.5 million acre-feet of water left in the lake, but the accessibility was terrible.
Fish and the people who catch them were also losers during the drought. In both 1976 and 1977, stream flows were low and water temperatures high, and these conditions reduced the survival of spawning salmon and steelhead and their eggs. In some instances, with help from federal funds, we were able to purchase cold water from storage reservoirs for downstream hatcheries and spawning areas. But for the most part, salmon and steelhead had to cope with poor spawning conditions. As a result, adult populations 3 and 4 years later have been reduced. In the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, spring outflow was particularly low in 1977. Survival of juvenile striped bass produced in that year was perhaps only 20% of normal. We don't believe that the drought has caused any permanent damage to our fisheries. Fish populations have experienced droughts before and will certainly do so again.
Outstanding examples of intergovernmental cooperation during the drought were the many water exchanges made by those with an adequate supply to those with a severe deficiency. Through these exchanges, San Joaquin Valley agriculture received nearly 90% of their state water project entitlement instead of the 40% they would have received. One of the largest exchanges was spearheaded by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California in cooperation with other agencies. During 1977, the Metropolitan Water District increased its deliveries from the Colorado River. MWD then relinquished a like amount of its entitlement to State Water Project water for use in the north. Some of this water was then diverted through the South Bay Aqueduct into San Antonio Reservoir, a facility of the City of San Francisco's water supply system. From there, a like amount of water was transferred through interconnecting pipelines to the City of Hayward's water supply system. Hayward then delivered the water to East Bay Municipal Utility District, who in turn transferred it to a pumping plant constructed by Marin Municipal Water District at the east end of the San Rafael Bridge. Water started flowing through the pipeline on June 7, 1977, and continued until the end of January 1978. Up to 9 million gallons of water per day were delivered during that period.
The pipeline across the San Rafael-Richmond Bridge was very important to the people of Marin County, and without it, we would have been out of water by July of that year without rationing. With rationing, we would have been out of water by September. It was so serious that our major reservoir, Nicasio Reservoir, which holds about 50% of our water, was completely dry by mid-year.
Much of the runoff from the watersheds of northern and central California finds its way eventually through the vast interlocking complex of waterways that comprise the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Consequently, the Delta is the central supply point for the California State Water Projects and the federal Central Valley Project. During the Pacific Ocean's tidal cycle, salt water surges into the Delta, where it blends with the freshwater outflow. To assure water supplies of suitable quality for the Delta region, as well as for export to water customers further south, the State Water Resources Control Board has established rigid standards for the salinity content of Delta water. During the summer months when stream flows recede, water quality is maintained by controlled freshwater releases from Shasta, Clare Engle, and Folsom Lakes, and from Lake Oroville. As the drought wore on and natural stream flow decreased, the salinity of the Delta began to rise. The obvious solution to this problem would have been the release of more water from upstream storage. However, reservoir levels were already dangerously low, and there was the lurking possibility of still another year of drought. Faced with a diminishing supply of fresh water, the State Water Resources Control Board adopted a resolution in February of 1977 lowering Delta water quality standards, although still maintaining an acceptable consumptive level. When no spring rains arrived, the standards were further lowered in June 1977. This was an emergency measure to maintain water in storage should the drought persist longer. Although these were serious times, the salinity levels of the Delta estuary never approached the levels of the two previous record drought years of 1924 and 1931. Salinity control was further aided by DWR's construction of 5 temporary rock barrier dams across selected Delta channels and a temporary cross-channel pumping plant on Middle River. These facilities, depending on their location, either repelled salt water or inhibited freshwater outflow to the sea and redirected it to areas of need. Although temporarily inconvenient to the boating public, much water was conserved in the critically low reservoirs by this innovative and temporary expedient.
For information on whitewater classes available in your area,
Drought Center.
call Yes.
Okay, I got the latest information here now what the rivers are doing.
To keep a concerned public informed about drought-related matters, an information center was established in the Resources Building in Sacramento. The center had a full-time phone staff with a toll-free line from anywhere in the state. At the height of the emergency, the staff answered more than 100 callers a day, some asking for information, others with suggestions for drought alleviation. Although not necessarily typical, some suggestions were on the order of,
why not tow an iceberg down from the North Pole and park it in San Francisco Bay?
Yeah, that's a little bit different idea.
How about importing some snow from the east in boxcars or airplanes?
Yes,
the center received some 4,500 letters and telegrams during its period of operation. During the water crisis, Water Resources also produced and distributed a series of water and energy conservation public service TV spots, as did several local water agencies. Typical examples were,
just a drop in the bucket. It's only a small leak. In the kitchen and the bath, in the shower and the garden. Small leaks adding up to big losses. Even the slowest drip wastes 20 gallons a day, 600 gallons a month, 7,000 gallons a year.
The California Department of Water Resources urges you to save water. Save every last drop. It saves energy, too. In California, drought hits everybody hard, including the agricultural community. But many water-conscious farmers are resourceful. They use plastic sheeting or gated pipe to reduce seepage losses. They collect irrigation runoff and pump it back for reuse. They use drip irrigation. The California Department of Water Resources urges all farmers to follow these good examples. Save water. Save every last drop. It saves energy, too. There's an old saying, you never miss the water till the well runs dry. In California, not only the wells are running dry, but the lakes, the reservoirs, and the rivers are all at dangerously low levels. While water agencies manage the water supplies we have left, the rest of us can help too by stopping water waste in and around our own homes. The California Department of Water Resources urges you to save water. Save every last drop. It saves energy too.
in the winter of 1978, the rains finally returned to California, and the drought was broken. However, it is likely that there will be more dry years in the future. How soon or how dry, no one can safely predict. If any single resource can take credit for drought alleviation, it must be California's large groundwater supplies. There is usable water in almost all valley areas, if one can afford to drill deep enough and buy the energy to pump it up from such depths. However, water from this source is not without its price. Groundwater tables were drawn dangerously low. It was at first thought that several years of bounteous water supply, coupled with intensive groundwater replenishment programs, would be required to restore the levels to normal. But the welcome and unusually wet winter and spring of 1978 allowed some groundwater basins to substantially recover.
The 1976-77 drought caused many disruptions to the people of our state. But if we have learned our lessons well, the effects of future droughts need not be so traumatic. For example, it's clear that those of us who live in urban areas can use substantially less water for domestic purposes with only minor crimps in our lifestyles. Effective conservation will require a change in attitudes, and we will have to come to grips with the fact that water is a limited resource, and that using less water must become a way of life in California. As the opportunity to develop more dams and surface water reservoirs diminishes, present water supplies must be used more efficiently. This will allow us to delay the need for more storage to meet future water demands. We must reduce demand for both urban and agricultural water. During the drought, the lack of a water grid in the Bay Area complicated the delivery of water from areas of surplus to areas of need. The circuitous route needed to get water to Marin County during the drought was a good example of the need to develop a system of interconnections between water systems, especially in major urban areas. Most of Southern California is already interconnected by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. To facilitate future transfers of water, new laws will be needed. Among the lessons learned in the drought is the need for greater cooperation between water agencies, not only in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta area, where the state and federal water projects divert many millions of cubic decimeters of water a year, but in all areas the state could benefit from a new spirit of cooperation. In the future, groundwater storage projects need to be developed to store excess water during wet years for subsequent use during dry periods, just as surface reservoirs have done for years. And we need new laws to help local agencies better manage our groundwater. Wastewater recycling must also be expanded to increase the usefulness of our limited supplies. There are many safe applications for use of reclaimed water. Every liter we can use will free a like amount of unused water for other purposes. And the growth of California requires additional water supplies, as well as better management of current supplies, so that future droughts do not find us unprepared.
There are reasons for optimism that water savings in the public sector may become a way of life. Statistics from local water agencies where rationing was in effect have shown that, after rationing stopped, consumers still used less water than in pre-drought periods. This without hardship or inconvenience. It is hoped that this attitude will continue to prevail in the years that lie ahead.
When it rains in California, remember that our summers are long, hot, and dry. Remember that California survives on the water it saves, on water stored in reservoirs and groundwater basins. And remember, the California Department of Water Resources wants you to save water all year long. Save every last drop. It saves energy, too.